Right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming, poets and friends and listeners, everyone out there on a Friday evening. So glad you could join us. I'm going to quickly introduce our editors who will be introducing the readers tonight. We're celebrating this beautiful book, 100 Poems to Save the Earth. Gorgeous book. Right. We'll start with Zoe. Zoe Brigley grew up in Wales. She has 3 Poetry Book Society recommended poetry collections: The Secret, Conquest, and Hand and Skull, all unmissable from Blood Axe Books. She also published nonfiction essays, Notes from a Swing State from Parthian, and also recently published a poetry chapbook, Obeyed After a French Movie from Broken Sleep. She will publish a poetry chapbook, Into Eros, with Verve Press this year. She runs an anti-violence advocacy podcast, Sinister Myth, How Stories We Tell Perpetuate Violence. She won an Eric Gregory Award for the Best British Poets Under 30, was Forward Prize commended, and listed in the Dylan Thomas Prize. She's assistant professor in English at Ohio State University. We're so happy that she can join us here today from Ohio. She also co-edited the summer edition of Poetry Wales, Beauteous, which I have right here too, as I do. It's a great issue. Also, she co-edited that with,
with Vicky Morris.
Vicky Morris, yes, sorry, flew right out of my head. Right, and now for Kristian Evans. Kristian Evans also is from Wales. He's a poet and editor from Kenfig. He's interested in deep ecology, animism, and the history of magic. He has written several texts for performance and a chapbook of poems, Unleaving, with Happenstance Press. He writes the column A Kenfig Journal for the environmental charity Sustainable Wales. Other Worlds, a chapbook of essays that he wrote with Zoe Brigley, will be published by Broken Sleep this year. He's also a practicing traditional astrologer. So welcome our editors. Give them a little silent clap. Welcome.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to you. I just want to start by saying huge thanks to everyone that's made this anthology happen. Thank you to Amy, who believed in the idea from the beginning. Thank you to Sarah at Saren, who's organized this launch and so much more. Thank you to Mick and to Jamie, who designed the cover and layout. And thanks most of all to our wonderful contributors for allowing us to include your poems. And also, of course, to Chris for being a great co-editor. And what a wonderful journey it's been during these pandemic times. It's just been very healing and wonderful reading and including all these poems. So let's get down to it. 100 Poems to Save the Earth is a title provocatively posed, not to make grandiose claims, but to bang the table. Because all of us need to be writing and campaigning about climate crisis now. Poetry helps us to process stuff emotionally and spiritually because we're not machines, and mitigating climate change is big, messy, and complex, and it can feel overwhelming. The climate change debates are often rooted in science and politics, but for us collectively to act, we need to be empowered as individuals. And this is where poetry can help, inspire, mourn with us, fire us up. The forces that impede change are those invested in the status quo. And those are often human institutions, big corporations, political parties, those who stand to lose profit. Feelings of climate doom often make us feel like our efforts are being hurled in vain against powerful lobbies. But in the bigger picture, activists, especially in developing countries, but also in the UK, the US, and elsewhere, have been fighting this fight for a long time. People are risking their lives, and they are also claiming victories, and we can't allow them to stand alone, no matter how hopeless it feels. Poetry helps us to look at the complexity of the issues, to feel how immense the challenge is, but also to feel hopeful and determined. It shows us that we can feel those two things at the same time. And so I'll pass over to Chris at that point.
Thanks, Zoe. Yes, indeed, the voices gathered here in this anthology often speak in terms of ecological justice, noting the connections between the exploitation of the environment and inequalities experienced by groups allowed fewer privileges. They implicitly and explicitly question what nature means, what the earth is, what our relations are and what they may yet become. Old certainties have been eroded by new circumstances. These poems absorb the changes, compost the waste, redraw the maps, and full of trust, keep going. We live in a time of unprecedented crisis, of mass extinction, accumulations of alarming data, and terrifying predictions. Increasingly, people are suffering from eco-anxiety and eco-grief as the bleak enormity of our situation sinks in. It often seems easier and better to close our eyes, to sleep and forget. A million ingenious distractions are just a click away, waiting to deliver a lullaby. Poetry, however, calls us to stay awake, to find the words to describe how it feels, to sing to what hurts, to reach out, to attend more closely and with more care to each other and to our fellow species, and to see all things as our kin. In fact, it may well be that poetry is exactly what we need to save the earth. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our first reader. Sasha Aurora Akhtar originates from Pakistan and was educated there and in the USA. Her debut poetry collection, The Grimoire of Grey Malkin, which I have here, was published in 2007 and greeted as a contemporary masterpiece, with the British newspaper The Guardian naming Akhtar as one of the top 12 poets to watch. So it's my great pleasure to hand you over to Sasha.
Thank you for that beautiful introduction to this project, Zoe and Kristian, and thank you for including me. And for somehow there's this beautiful train that a poem that you maybe long forgot suddenly comes up again because it affected somebody else and you didn't know. So that's how this poem ended up in the anthology. And I'd like to say it arrived exactly today. The poem is called The Sufi. Surrender I, speak, a word for you. A pot on flame melts before we eat, glistening like cherry winter, like boot black. I polish indefinitely, reach my dizzy head in all its circumference, touch, choose a card, save sure till you mean it. I'll clock your time in true beads. Tonight I see a crash. Next morning, wizard hollers. A crestfallen face, a dust rudder. Who was there on this winter's morn? I saw snow devils whirling and lost myself. Wine pour backwards. Hold. So that's the whole poem. Thank you. Thanks for the claps.
Yeah, Sasha, I was wondering actually, would you be able to tell us something about the Sufis? I mean, this poem is one I think I mentioned to you before. It's been with me for years and years. Actually, I first read it years ago in the anthology Infinite Difference, and I thought, you know, for me, I think that, you know, as we've been saying, that the ecological crisis is perhaps also a crisis of meaning, perhaps also a spiritual crisis. And so I wonder if you could tell us something about why you chose to write a poem about the Sufi.
Well, to be very honest, my entire creative practice, you know, since I sort of became a young adult, has been heavily, deeply involved in esoteric practices and studying the history of everything, really, the origins of Buddhism, and in particular of Sufi thought. And that was perpetuated in the beginning by, you know, Rumi and Hafiz. However, I wanted to go a lot deeper because it's very personal for me. You know, I grew up in a very fundamentalist Muslim country, and I couldn't find what I needed when I was there. But when I left there, that's when you know, I believe in, you know, many intuitive ways of learning and living, and a lot of things just sort of came as I started seeking them. And I believe that the understanding of Sufism, you know, has what it is. It's a problem of translation, because you see Coleman Barks, he is credited with bringing it to the West, right? And then he's just gone on, and he's created this beautiful connection. However, if you ask the Iranis, you know, and so many other people about, you know, how this has been transmitted, they will tell you that it's not transmitted in the way that they believe it should be, you see. So for me, the journey began with finding out, you know, finding the lesser known translators, finding you know, the theories, the philosophies. And when this poem arrived, you see, it's very much a mix of the poetics of trance, and that's one of the things I've always been interested in. And one of the big things about Sufism is that this idea of scrambling the senses while the teaching is sort of secretly given. And this has always stayed with me. I've never actually, because also I was always in a contradiction about, because a true Sufi never reveals their name. You know, you are just in the world and you are working, you're serving people. That's actually that's the essence of it. So people, what is Sufism? Very simple, serving people. But whatever that entails, that is a deep journey, you see. So I wanted to, my entire work, all my work is about taking these archetypes, these of the spiritual journey, and a lot of it is Sufi, but a lot of it is also Buddhist and wider pagan and shamanic. So one of the symbols is, you know, polishing the heart. So this mirror and the polishing the heart is constant in Sufi poetry. So that was sort of how this poem arrived, that I wanted to sort of bring it in English, and it has all those tropes in it. But, you know, it's just magical to me that it stayed with you. So the teaching somehow smuggled itself to you.
Absolutely, yeah. Oh, that's brilliant, fascinating, and I think a really brilliant way to start the evening session. Thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you.
I think over to you now, Zoe.
Yes, let me just unmute. So our next reader is Abir Amir, and Abir just had a debut collection from Seren, Inhale, Exhale, which has been very well received so far. She has interest in photography, Islamic art, and painting. She's a regular to poetry events and readings in South Wales, and her writing is both extremely well observed and deeply compassionate for its subjects. We were very moved by the poem that she's going to read from the anthology, which puts in parallel the complexity of motherhood and the treatment of birds and creatures. So let's hear that poem now.
Oh, thank you so much, Zoe. It's a real honor to be part of this beautiful book. I'm so proud and happy. Thank you. So I'll share this poem now. It's called The Storyteller. Aesop had nothing on her. The children gather on the rooftop level with the heads of Nejef's palm trees, sit cross-legged, ready for stories before bed. An uneasy weight on her chest. She'd found her youngest trapping sparrows again. كان مكان في قديم الزمان كان أكو فرد بلبل. There was, and how much there was. She tells the story of a beautiful bulbul. Shiny feathers, bright plumes, how its song filled the air until the king ordered it be caught and caged, kept for his eyes only. Soon its feathers grayed, the light in its eyes vanished, the song in its throat withered. Her eyes wander to that space, empty since his 4th birthday. She continues. The bulbul's mournful mother searched everywhere for her child, unable to eat or sleep. Both died from sadness. The king, filled with remorse, promised to protect all his kingdom's wildlife. Then he became the kindest, wisest king on earth. And they lived a happy life. وَعَاشَوْا عِيشَةً سَعِيدَةً. She looks to the stars, mutters, when you cling to a thing you love, it dies. Sometimes when you love, you must let go. Must let go. Her soft voice trails off. The children focus on the cigarette in her left hand, which balances a tower of ash. In her right hand, amber prayer beads. Her thumb strokes the top of each before moving it along. She recites Al-Fatiha, scans the sky for the crescent moon. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you. It's so great to hear these poems read out loud. And I guess one of the first things that really struck me about this poem was how vividly you create a portrait of this moment in time. And as I was saying to you, I almost feel like it's a short story in a poem. Very intriguing. And I guess I wanted to ask you about the mother who's like the central figure in the poem, who has all these kids playing around her, and she starts telling them the story of the king who imprisoned this bird. And I thought how fascinating it was to think about motherhood and this idea of carrying stories, the stories we inherit from maternal figures in our life, whether they're biological mothers or people who serve as mothers to us. And I wondered if you could tell us a bit about that.
Well, the character in this story poem is actually my grandmother. And the story is how I remember it being told to me by my father. So it is a true story in a sense, and it's also a poem. I think for me it was how kind of my grandmother used to teach the children, and they weren't all her children, they were actually my father's cousins as well, so they all used to sleep on the flat roof, which we could do with probably these days because, you know, it's quite warm and it'd be nice to just sleep in the open air. So she taught them a lot of morals actually through her stories, and these are then passed on. So it feels like there's a link now in my book with my, you know, grandparents and great grandparents, and that's why I wrote it. Really, as it starts the book, actually, my own collection.
Yeah, and I sensed that in the poem that this was like a really strong maternal figure. And of course, the kind of moral that the story has is actually an ecological one, because it starts off and she knows the kids have been trapping sparrows, and she's you know, and then so she comes and brings this story about the king and the caged bird and what happens. And I guess I thought that was really interesting to see, you know, just, you know, another type of story, a kind of mythical story, which is so relevant to our times right now.
Yeah, I think. Thank you for saying that. It seems to teach about our relationship on the earth, with not just our fellow human beings, but also the fellow creatures, including creatures that we see as able to move and kind of communicate with each other. So the birds, but also the trees, and even inanimate parts of the earth as well, that we do have a relationship to look after, a relationship with. So.
Yeah. And that's something that I found really beautiful about this poem too, is that sense of breaking down that separation, or those walls we sometimes build between the things that are human or non-human, or, we would probably say more than human, and how actually we're all part of one thing. And I definitely had a sense of that in that poem. So thank you so much. It was lovely to hear it read out loud. Thank you. So great to talk about and hear that poem. And our next reader is Leo Bois, who is a Latinx bilingual poet, translator, and educator, born in Argentina, who lives in the UK. Recent fellow of the Complete Works, was a co-director of the Invisible Presence, an Arts Council England national scheme to nurture new Latinx writers in the UK. Board member of Magma Poetry, and won the Keats Shelley Prize in 2019, and now has a really exciting new debut out. So I'm really looking forward to hearing this poem.
Thank you so much, Zoe and Chris. I'm delighted to be here tonight with all of you, and I'm really thrilled to be part of this anthology. I loved it when I saw the proofs. I absolutely, it was fantastic. I just love the book, and I can't wait to have it with me. So I'm going to share my poem, and it's called "Goldfinch Comes to Tell Us There is a Fire at the End of Our Garden. He lands on my hand, carries bad news. A fire broke out in our courtyard, puffs out his bronze chest, then begins his report. There, where the chair is, something bursting sparks. He's surprised how fast flames grow in size, how thunderous are. He can't believe it, not one bit. He explains, his black and yellow wings fluttering fast, charred string, scorched twigs, half-burnt feathers, and a corpse. His high-pitched whiz picks up speed. He cannot stop. Crackling sounds grow louder, flashing flames on our plane tree. Fire surrounds us. The house spins, the ivy climbed by dark orange glares. Sky turns ominous, ash flies. And there, at the end of our garden, tall, the giant ball glows a bright red, maroon, resplendent, blowing shards, magenta. It takes us a lifetime to see it. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. It's great to hear that read out loud again. And so when Chris and I were talking about this poem, we sat down and talked about all these poems and remembered why we enjoyed them so much. And there was one thing that really struck me about this poem, which you won't be able to see so much because you can't see it on the page. But basically the title is "Goldfish Comes to Tell Us There's a Fire at the End of Our Garden. He line break." And I thought, I saw this and I thought, oh, this is actually really clever. And I like that decision a lot. And I wondered if you could talk to us a bit about that and the centering of the bird in the poem as well, and their point of view.
Yeah, well, very much. I wrote this poem during the pandemic. It was a very difficult time for all of us. And I remember I was reading about all these wildfires in Australia, in California, in Siberia, and also fires, in Amazon and in the Amazon forest and in Argentina. This probably man-made. So I was reading and this poem came out. While I was in during the pandemic, I was obsessed with counting syllables. Somehow I became obsessed with I wrote many haikus. I wrote many poems in syllabics. This poem is a poem in syllabics, inspired by a syllabic poem by Mary Moore. Perhaps I don't know why I was just obsessed with this counting. Perhaps counting the days, counting the hours. So the first thing that came out, it was the actual title. I almost, I had that title at the beginning, and I wrote it down, and I knew that was going to be the title. That long line, and then that he, and then it all began from there. I'm obsessed as well with birds. I'm a member of the RSPB, and I am a keen bird watcher. As I said, I live here in Deal, and we have many birds, and especially birds that come from other parts of the world, because this is the first place that they land, especially in spring and autumn. So I'm always there with my binoculars looking at birds, and I sometimes talk to them. I feel like this communion with them. I feel an equal to birds, and especially goldfinches somehow. I do have quite a few poems about goldfinches where I talk to goldfinches or yes. And so that's the story behind this this poem. Yeah.
Right. And I do feel like it's a poem that asks us to be more humble, that the goldfinch is talking away and we're not listening. I think that's the really powerful thing at the end of that poem, is that we're not listening to the warning.
Exactly. Yeah, and this idea of the goldfinch being the messenger, bringing, in this case, really bad news, and so yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a wonderful poem. I'm so glad we were able to include it. Perfect. I'll hand over to Chris to introduce the next few poets.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Leo. So, Kath Drake's collection, The Shaking City, highly commended in the 2020 Forward Prizes, followed Sleeping with Rivers, which was a Poetry Book Society choice and winner of the Seren Mislexia Pamphlet Prize. Kath is Australian born and hosts The Veranda, which is an online poetry teaching and events. She's an award-winning journalist with a specialism and postgraduate qualification in environmental science. It's a great pleasure to hand you over to Kath Drake.
Thank you. It's great to be in this marvellous collection. I'm going to read my poem called How to Hold the World in This Climate Emergency. Sometimes I hold world in one hand, my life in the other, and I get cricks in my neck. As the balance keeps swinging, I walk uneasily. Sometimes I am bent over with the sheer weight of world, eyes downcast, picking up useful things from the ground. Sometimes one shoulder is pulling toward an ear as if it's trying to block the ear from hearing, but can't quite reach. Sometimes my body is a crash mat for world. I want to say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. But I don't say it aloud. I am privileged, so I should be able to do something. Sometimes I lie on my side and I grasp world like a cushion. I'm soft and young and I don't feel I can change anything. I nudge world with affection, whispering, I know, I know. Sometimes I build a cubby from blankets thrown over furniture. There's only inside, no outside. When I was a child, world was a small dome and change came summer by summer. And sometimes I make a simple frame with my arms to look at world. I'm not involved directly. It carries on without me. And that way I can still love the sky and its patterns of clouds and contrails. Sometimes I'm chasing world through the woods, bursting with hope and adrenaline. Oh God, am I running? I want to keep moving. My mouth is full of fire. Some days I like bread and milk. I just get on with pouring and buttering. I want the little things to be what matters most again. Sometimes I hold little. I'm limp and ill. Days barely exist. It's enough to make soup.
Thanks so much, Kath.
We see about climate anxiety there.
Well, exactly. I mean, let's start with that. I think, I think when we deal with these, when we think about these huge existential issues all the time, it really can get to be quite a burden, and I think, I think what the poem seems to be saying is that self-care is also, important, and our health is reflected in the world's health, and vice versa.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so is that something you've become more aware of recently? I mean, you've been writing about ecological matters for a long time. It's always been at the heart of your work, and
yeah.
So I just wondered how your approach has evolved over the years, or if at all.
Interesting with self-care, because I'm a mindfulness teacher as well, and I think that being mindful about nature, well, that's pretty core to the whole thing, if you ask me. But I think just to speak to the poem briefly, and it's really about physicality. It's from looking at a video actually at Tate Modern of an artist who was actually it was black and white photos of different poses. I was thinking about how to express the physicality of emotion that's held in the body. I think it's about acknowledging what is going on is the first step. Not looking away is the first step, and that can be really hard. And I think, all of those emotions in the poem, all of them exist, all of them do swing. But I think it's good to know we're all in this, we're in it together. So a lot of people have these feelings. That is some comfort. And also that, the self-care, that, sometimes it's enough to look after yourself. And other times I'll be running through the woods shouting, do something, So, those things do I do change. I don't find it a negative poem. I find it that, acknowledgement is really important. But I come from a place of wilderness. I'm from Perth, Western Australia. I grew up by the sea. I grew up in the bush, really, because bush is all around you. It's not a very big city. There's, it's one of the few first world rich places in the world that's got a lot of wilderness, a lot of old growth. So since a teenager, I really felt what was going on very much. I could see, in Australia, most of the land has been cleared post 1950. Okay, most of it, like Dust Bowl in the West Australian wheat belt. So that and a lot I've seen in my lifetime. So I always thought as a teenager, look, there's something wrong here. There's something really wrong with our relationship with nature. I can see a disaster. We need a total rethink. So I've always thought that, and I studied environmental science. I was a writer and journalist and broadcaster and everything on these issues for a long time. I moved to London and found it wasn't really on the agenda here, and actually not much wilderness. What a difference when you don't have that interface with wilderness, with experiences of wilderness on a regular basis. So in a way, I think, and it wasn't just that, it was people ridiculed you actually for being a greenie. And that was really hard. If I told anyone at a party that's what I do, I would often get attacked verbally, really, oh, well, you do this or you do that, or why, and people would think that just by saying what I do, I'm blaming them for their lifestyle, and not taking responsibility for my lifestyle. So sometimes it was pretty hard. And when I came to London, I think it was kind of worse to have that perspective. In a way, I pushed it down a bit, and I have to keep giving myself permission to write about it. People like Jory Graham really helped me with that. So, yeah, I really think, being able to keep giving myself permission is important. And also, I think we need a total overhaul of what eco-poetry is. I don't actually believe in the term myself. I think it should be everything we do now. Yeah, I think now people are listening more. People are more interested. It's more urgent. You can see what's going on. I guess I feel less put down for being, this person who was trying to push radical rethinking, and we're less a sort of marginalised, although in Australia things have got pretty bad with climate denial, as you probably know, which is absolutely tragic. So I think at the moment I'm looking at lots of how we reinvent that even more, how we reinvent how we see the past, the present and the future. I find myself, particularly in lockdown, looking back at the past a lot as well and thinking, well, what didn't we see and how would we have seen that differently? Why I've written kind of some weird poems about TV programs and how the assumptions they make about our relationship with the natural world, and actually how much our culture is like a scaffolding that holds all that up. And we need to start pulling that scaffolding apart, like really seriously, not just little one stick at a time. So, yes, I think I've answered your question. I can't remember where I started.
No, that's brilliant. Yeah, that's brilliant. I mean, I think too, it's really interesting to recognize, and to acknowledge that sense that, I mean, I can remember when I was a kid, people thought it was a joke, if you cared about the environment. It was like somehow, it was something effeminate, maybe even, to be interested in other species than your own. And I wonder, is that changing, or has it just become unacceptable now?
I think it's definitely changing, because there's a lot more interest in it. There's a lot more books about it. There's a lot more, there's a lot more on the news. People can see the fires in, the Amazon in Australia. People can see the impact of climate change. I think it is changing. It is changing, but I think it's weird. There's a lot of people who, I find it strange that, I mean, this might sound strange, but I find it odd that people are just coming to it now and realizing it. Like, I saw an emergency when I was a teenager, and I find this, and in a way, yeah, I don't know why that's important to say, but I do think we need to acknowledge in a way that this has been going on for a long time. Like Silent Spring, what was that, in the 60s or the late 50s or something? And I mean, that awareness that we're on this, on this path leading to destruction has been around for decades. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, and to acknowledge what work's been done in the past, and bring that forward, bring that right into focus. All of those people I know who sacrificed, people I knew in Australia who sacrificed immense things to save pieces of the environment over there, a lot of that which the right-wing government has now squashed. But, that is, the immense sacrifice that people go through are sometimes to be greenies, I would say.
Kath, thanks so much. That's really, really brilliant. And thanks for that excellent perspective. Well, our next reader is an accomplished and versatile writer, one of those we might be jealous of, because they are as good at writing short stories as they are at writing poems. Andre Mangio has 2 books of short story collections from Salt, and 3 poetry collections, Natural Causes, Mixer, and Blood Rain. Many of the poems follow people in a landscape. These humans are dwelling with respect in a landscape, and I find the subtle interactions with people and places incredibly moving and intriguing. So without anything more from me, I'll pass you on to Andre.
Thanks so much, Kristian. I think sometimes, I think I'll just read the poem first. That's the best thing to do. It's called Wild Honey. Twisting the spoon in deep, you watch gold uncoil into your porridge bowl, where bees and butterflies are lacquered round the rim. Beyond the glass, it's several summers since they buzzed and flitted through our thistle-spotted grass, the back meadows, poppy, yarrow, lady's bedstraw. From even there, mites and parasites, varroa, wax moth, foul brood, have thinned them to a smatter. And now with diggers, ploughs and cutters, 3 hedgerows in a day and every flower goes under, another swathe of pasture laid out for its bypass. And so, watched only by the stars, pockets bursting, we steal out and scatter through the night, packet after packet, red campion, crested dog's tail, bird's foot trefoil, viper's bugloss.
Wonderful. Thanks, Andre. Yeah, there's so much about this poem that I love. I mean, where did this poem come from, perhaps, Andre? Perhaps you could tell us something about the genesis of it.
Yeah, well, I think sometimes it's quite hard to know where poems come from, and it's quite invidious to try and examine them in that way, and I tend to try and avoid it. But in this one, there were several pretty clear things. One was a love for a very long time of Michael Longley's poetry, and a recognition that I couldn't write anything within a planet of what he was doing. But when certain things came together with this poem, I thought I had some of the material that could be a kind of sub-Michael Longley poem. And I feel it kind of works. But I mean, the main impetus, well, one starting point was simply the uplifting effect that wildflowers and meadows and green spaces have on us all, and certainly have on me. And not just the variety of species and colours and scents, but the beautiful and evocative names and associations that many of these plants have. And that is definitely something of a gift for a poet. And of course, someone like Longley is a master at using those things and place names and things like that. So that was one thing that I had in my kind of palette there. I suppose there was a real event when they were ploughing up an area of farmers' fields and knocking down some trees for a bypass around a town in Suffolk where I lived a few years ago. And a friend and I did go out at night and just symbolically throw some seeds on this ploughed land, not because it wasn't about to be covered in concrete, but it was a gesture at least. I knew that because of what was going on with the planet and the subject matter of this, I wanted to suggest both sadness and anger at what we're losing. And in this case, I wanted to focus on the smallest, most fragile and vital things. So the wildflowers, the pollinators that are so codependent, but also for the poem somehow to convey resistance. So although it's just saying really there's still time, all is not lost, provided we come together, we object, we each take some form of personal action and responsibility, I suppose. However small and futile that may seem, it isn't. And then obviously I was focusing on the bees and noticing how very clear it was that compared to 30, 20, even 10 years ago, how few bees I see now in the garden. And that ties up with awareness that if human behavior like farming methods and land management and planning laws and all these things don't change rapidly and radically, and the bees and other vital insects disappear, that's a sign that we're basically finished. Although they're the smallest things, we won't have the crops and plants and food that we need. I also was lucky with the research into bees to find some of the parasites that also are threatening them, because I wanted that sinister sounding enemy to be in there. So varroa, wax moth, foul brood, they did a lot of work for me in the poem just by naming them. They sound like, sort of something out of a movie really, that coming at the good guys. And then I wanted the poem to end on a sort of ambivalent note. So although it goes from dark to more hopeful, I thought Viper's Blue Goss was a perfect one to end on, because the viper is kind of ambivalent there. It's a flower, but you've got the beauty and the threat. So I guess those are the things that I swirled around and came up with the poem from.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, I think for me, reading this poem, I immediately thought of my children. That, honey and stirring honey into porridge. I was thinking of my own children, and something we do out here as well is we go and scatter seed around. Just when we've got some spare seeds, we'll sprinkle them around the roads. I wonder if, as we lose wildflowers, what else are we losing there? I think I was reading what was it called, Braiding Sweetgrass, by Robin Wall Kimmerer recently, and she writes really eloquently about the sort of Native American approach to flowers, and how wildflowers are also medicines, and also they also carry lots of stories and mythology. And as you say as you say, talking about the poem, that the names of these flowers often sort of hint at a story that we've lost already, almost. So I just wonder if there's any, if that's, if there's a lost knowledge in these flowers somehow, that, can we get it back, or is it gone for good, or?
Well, no, as I say, I don't think it's gone for good. There are lots of places in the world. I don't know where they are, but you will know better than I, that are trying to grow and preserve every species of crop, plant, flower from seed. So they are retaining those in order to, if things go badly wrong, we still have some of those seeds and ability to propagate them. I've seen those banks, they're kind of like archived banks of, it's all seed, and it's all, so that is definitely good. But I mean, we would like to see them in the natural state and in the wild, and respected and nourished, not abused and taken for granted. I'm not a naturalist, and I'm not a scientist, and I just react as a layman. So I'm pretty ignorant about what the future holds, apart from the fact that we all have to object and resist when we see things that are not right.
Brilliant. Andre, thanks very, very much indeed. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure, and thank you so much. It's an honor to be included with so many wonderful poets. And I'm, as Sasha said, the book arrived on perfect timing this afternoon. I'm so looking forward to devouring it. Thank you.
Thanks, Andre. Thanks very much.
Oh, that was wonderful. That was wonderful. And our next poet is Jennifer Wong, whom I'm excited to hear read. She was born and raised in Hong Kong. Her most recent poetry collection is Letters Home from Nine Arches. I really enjoyed this book, which I felt had a quiet and penetrating beauty. Often the poems deal with complex feelings about identity, culture, and being a mother. And I think they're also very emotionally nimble, as in the poem that Jennifer's going to read tonight, Yangtze River.
Thank you very much. It's just really wonderful to be in the company of all of you. Yangtze. Small tourist boats pass through spectacular relief. In the valley, you hear a wind made sublime by the poets. To weep for what used to be the largest cradle of fish and shrimps. The depth of this water's wrath, devouring the children and Stone Age relics. To tame the water dragon is as impossible as learning to live with it. Do not ask me where the white dolphins belong in the bigger river of things. I don't want to know what happens to the porpoises. Please stop asking. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. So I thought that this was a very clever and evocative poem. And it really revolves around this really sad thing, which is that the river dolphin is basically extinct in the Yangtze. And I wondered if you could talk about how this poem seems to me to be about how do we process these kinds of losses, these extinctions, and where species are just disappearing.
Yes, so I think like when I was writing this poem, they were already extinct, and I was, as I made the research, it was quite painful process, just kind of finding out how lovely they were, and that they could have they existed like for 20 million years, like that was their home, and of course like the home, like we human beings have claim to it as well. But then I think whose duty is it to defend or protect these dolphins? And also I was thinking about like the dolphins and the cousin species, the porpoises, which are also pretty endangered. And then thinking about how in my childhood in Hong Kong there were like the pink dolphins, which were also extremely endangered, and it's like seeing all these decreasing numbers and until extinction. It's a journey, but during those years, like who or what can we do about it? And I was also thinking that's why the ending of the poem, it's a bit negative in some ways, but it's also a question for a lot of us, and for myself as well. Like what do we do about it? And do we think that it's okay to, that there's this hole in our world, or, whose fault is it? Sometimes I think growing up, me and my friends, sometimes we think that it is fine if the climate change is a movie, and, other things, let's say A Touch of Sin, I saw these Yangtze rivers, the big scenes and the industrial images, we think that it's not related or not so related to us, but at the end of the day, it's our earth and it's our own home.
Yeah, thank you. And I felt that it was a poem that was quite clever emotionally, and I didn't feel like it was negative actually. At the end of the poem you kind of say, oh, and there's also the porpoises, what's happening to them, and please don't ask me about it right now. Something that we wanted in the anthology were poems that kind of work towards processing that actually these things are very painful. They're hard to look at, they're hard to process, and we didn't want to have a lot of poems which solely kind of looked at things very positively, because I think we both felt that wasn't realistic, that we have to kind of process those feelings of sadness and loss in order to be able to act. And so I actually really liked the end of that poem. And in a way, it chimes a little bit with Kath, I think, in that sense in which she says, some days all I can do is make soup. I'm just doing my best, I'm surviving. And so I thought that was very beautifully framed. And I think there's something that's very strong in your work generally. But was it a painful poem to write? I think you were beginning to say that it was.
Yes, yeah, thank you. Yes, it's indeed. Yeah, I think like the pain is all part of it, isn't it? And realizing also what it can tell us, and hopefully, if we have a better way to think of it, and if there's more that we can do other than the more escapist way of thinking about it, being aware of, like what this anthology is offering to us, being aware of the threats around us, it's important.
Yes, thank you so much. Really appreciate you letting us include this poem in the anthology. It's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. And that brings us to our very last poet who's going to be reading, George Surtees, who needs no introduction, but I will try to give him one anyway. So he has a list of prizes and honors as long as my arm, and really he's one of our great English poets. Drawing on his Hungarian roots, in moving and illuminating writing. For example, his wonderful non-fiction book about his mother, The Photographer at 16, which I really recommend. And that's not to mention all his poetry collections. But what I always appreciate about George's writing is how humane he is towards those who experience suffering. And yet he also has a razor-sharp wit, as you may know if you've encountered his 30 poets go to the gym. It's fascinating to see him turn that razor-sharp yet humane attention to England in this next poem that he's going to read for us.
Thank you very much. It's a very, very kind introduction. I'm very flattered and I'm very proud to be in this anthology with all those very fine poets. This is quite an old poem, as you can probably guess by the reference towards the end about a strange new century. So this will take me back to about 1999. And we had moved to the place we're living in about 5 or 6 years. And there's a little river which runs through the town, which is a walk for us, a regular, almost daily walk for us. And that is where this begins. I suppose it's a poem about anxiety as much as anything. It doesn't say what the anxiety is about. One of the last thing I'll say about it is that, well, I was born in one capital city, Budapest. Then I did all my schooling and was brought up in another one, which is London. Then I did my higher education in Leeds, another major city. And then slowly, little bit by little bit, I've been sort of countrified a little bit, but it has been a slow process for me. And the thing about the poem is called Climate, but partly because I kind of had an understanding that Britain doesn't have a climate, it has weather. So, and the distinction being that weather changes all the time. And, it's changed from yesterday to today, and it's going to change again at the weekend. And if I were living in Hungary, and if I went to summer, I kind of know it's going to get hotter and hotter and hotter till about the 20th of August, when there would be a thunderstorm and it would break and then would be more or less entering autumn. So I'll get back to the poem. Climate. The sky is broken. There's the usual scud of dense cloud, showers, lightning, a shower, and then the cycle begins again. Each hour is a new foray into a thin skim of mud beside the river. Ducks huddle under leaves, then waddle out into brief sunshine. Nowhere will you find any fixed point that might bear your weight or even your spirits. Nothing receives the imprint of your shoe. It is England, of course, not one of the dependable climates. Things fly in muscular gusts, flags, bunting, news sheets. It is as if there were some irresistible force blowing us over into a strange new century that billows beyond us, between our thin heartbeats.
Thank you so much. Whenever I read this poem, I always get a kind of slightly eerie feeling. I feel like it's a very prescient poem. I'm thinking about things that have happened since it's been written, about how, Brexit happened and, certain things in terms of like, some people say there's a kind of crisis of Englishness. And I felt that this was a really clever poem in capturing something, not only about the English landscape, the weather, but also the culture. And so I was wondering if you could talk about if there was a particular moment or experience that inspired this poem, which feels a little bit ominous to me.
I think the sense of, I think most poets have such a sense. I think we work on our apprehensions. Our apprehensions are part of our material, a part of our substance. And we, like water diviners in a way, we kind of feel that things move. And this was partly the uncertainty of moving actually not just into a new century, but into a new millennium. That whole huge change. The sense of England that you talk about is a fascinating and in some ways a very fragile and undefined thing. I mean, I always describe myself as kind of British because that's an administrative identity. I know what that is. I have never described myself as English. But it's trying to understand the place, and it's trying to understand what kind of soil one is walking on, what kind of temperament one is kind of interchanging with. And everything's slightly unstable. I mean, in a way, it is always unstable. That's the weather part. But of course, in the background, there are other bigger, more tidal kind of changes going on. I mean, this is 16 years before Brexit. And Brexit to me is just not a symptom. It is a symptom of something that is happening in the island, if you like. This island, chiefly happening in England, more than it does, I think, in Scotland or Wales or certainly Ireland, in which all those apprehensions that are, if you like, form a very fine net under the normal experience of things, just begin to feel a little bit tenser. And the changes that, we are talking here specifically about climate change. But there are many other kind of historical changes, great social changes, I think, we're undergoing. We never know where these changes lead us. So yes, it's, if you like, a dramatization of my own insecurities.
But I love the phrase flags, bunting, and news sheets. I thought that was just brilliant, for thinking about England and Englishness. And I guess something that really interests me about this poem as well is I feel like something we wanted to bring out in the book was, like you were saying, this sense of kind of social change and social problems being very much connected to environmental ones. So, if we don't have, a kind of government that is willing to enact certain policies in relation to the environment, then we really have a problem. And, this all seemed to be interconnected for us in this poem. And that sense of a crisis of Englishness, and maybe thinking about English nationalism, and how perhaps some of these things are preventing progress, in terms of thinking about social problems, but also about in terms of like environmental ones. And so it was really, quite eerie to read it and to think that it was.
It's people used to talk about pathetic fallacy, which nature mirrors in some way human events. But I think pathetic fallacy is a two-way street. So it kind of moves along both axes. They move along the similar axes. I have no hopes of this government whatsoever. But I don't imagine I'm alone in that. And, it's a matter of just how long this particular farce kind of goes on. And with a bit of luck, although it'll need actually a lot of luck to deliver us out of it. I don't want to sound particularly political. It's not. I don't want poems that have too much of a design on us, which is basically what Keats said about poetry. That he really disliked poems that have too much of a design on us. But you can't help where you come from. You can't help where your apprehensions lie. So eventually, they form themselves. If you're a writer, they form themselves in words. If you're a poet, they form themselves in poems.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's really wonderful. And it just puts me in mind of this sense of you know, if you're somebody who cares about the environment and climate crisis, that you have to kind of balance these two things. As a lot of our poets have said in their poems, you have to balance a sense of realism and realizing what it is that you're up against, that it's difficult and tough to process, and at the same time having a sense of hope as well, and being determined to make change. And you can sort of feel both of those things at once, and hopefully this anthology will help people to process that and to be able to hold those two things at once.
Many congratulations to both Chris and you on putting it together, and everybody else that makes it happen.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. We both do so much. And so we've come to the end of our readers, such wonderful, wonderful poems. And we're going to have a lot of launches and events here in the UK with you and in the US over the next year. So please definitely sign up to the Saren newsletter. You can find that on the website. And you know, if you do that, they'll send out stuff about those events with different poets, and maybe some of the same poets as well as some of those too. So I'm really looking forward to that. And the whole year is going to just be really celebrating the poems, the poets, and the anthology. Did you want to add anything to that, Chris?
I just echo what you said and thank everyone for coming this evening, and thanks to our poets for reading so wonderfully, and for answering our questions as well. Thank you very much indeed.
I think that some people from Saren, maybe Mick, had wanted to say something at the end.
Hello, I'll just say thank you to everybody. Mick, would you like to say something?
I was just typing my thanks, actually, to everyone for coming, to the readers especially for some fantastic readings and some really interesting answers to the questions posed by Chris and Zoe, and just to Chris and Zoe as well for a fantastic book, which we really hope is going to make some sort of a difference somewhere along the line. Thank you.